Um, the Japan Foundation is a semi-governmental non-profit organization which promotes cultural exchange between Japan and the countries overseas. And we have an office in LA, Los Angeles, and one more, New York in the US. And we have been holding a lot of cultural events in our facility in Los Angeles before COVID-19, but today today's lecturer, Michael van Hartingsveld, was one of the best lecturers for our events. And so I am so happy to invite him again virtually so that we can reach everyone in the States or in the world. So I have before the lecture, I have a few housekeeping announcements. First, please use Q&A function to make a question to the lecturer, and probably our staff can answer for your question, and Michael, the lecturer himself, will review your questions at the end of his lecture. And second, we prepared just a quick questionnaire at the end of these events to improve our next event. So please cooperate our questionnaire before leaving. And third, this is just one of our cultural events online, and we are planning a lot to come in the future. So please follow our SNS like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to get further information about our future programs. And you can find you can subscribe our email news through our website. So please search our Japan Foundation Los Angeles website, and please subscribe our newsletter if you have not received yet. So, and without further ado, I like to invite Michael van Hartingsveld. Please, Michael, come in. Oops, some sorry about the technical trouble. I'm trying to turn on his video.
Well, I mean, if everybody can hear me right now, I can at least maybe just talk a little bit until we get the camera on, and then I can introduce myself. My name is Michael van Hartingsveld. I am well acquainted with the Japan Foundation Los Angeles. I've done a lot of work with them, including on lectures and also in exhibitions. There's a lot of stuff that I want to tell you all about, but as we only have 30 minutes, I think the best thing that I can do right now is just launch directly into the presentation. So I'm going to do that right now. I'll share the screen, and I also need to wait for the screen to be able, permissions to turn the screen on. All right. All right. So I hope you can all see the screen. This lecture series is called The Who's Who of Japanese Deities and How to Identify Them in Japanese Art. So the purpose of this entire lecture series is to help you walk into a temple or walk into a museum, look at a piece of art and look at different features or different details of them and be able to say, oh yes, that's a bodhisattva. Oh yes, that's a wisdom king. Oh yes, that's a celestial being. I want you to be able to independently, without having any sort of resources available in front of you, be able to identify the most popular of the Japanese deities in Buddhism. There are 4 classifications of the hierarchy of deities there. You've got Buddhas up at the top. Nyorai is the Japanese term for that. There are Bodhisattvas, Bosatsu. There are wisdom kings, or Myo-o, and there are celestial beings, which are Tenbu. Last lecture, we had talked about the celestial beings. It was a very, very information-packed presentation that I did. And this time, I've kind of scaled back the number of deities that we are trying to cover, and I'm only going to do about 6 this time. And I'm really hoping to kind of get into the nitty-gritty to help you look at those details and really analyze them. One of my favorite sayings when we're talking about Japanese art, especially Buddhist art, is that there is always an exception. There is always going to be something that breaks the rules or breaks the sort of guidelines that I'm laying out for you right now. You might look at something and say, oh yes, of course that is a celestial being, but then there's going to be that it might be an exception. It might be something that says, oh, this doesn't actually follow the what Michael has said. And I ask that you please don't hold that against me. Just know that there are always exceptions out there because there are certain creative liberties that were taken when making these sculptures or preparing them. So this lecture, as I said before, it's covering the Myo-o, or wisdom kings. There are other definitions for that. It can also mean kings of light. It can also mean kings of brightness. Myo has many different definitions in Japanese, translated over to English, and so you might see them described in many different ways. Kings of light, kings of brightness, wisdom kings, knowledge kings, mantra kings. You might see different names associated with them. But I'm going with wisdom kings because that's the most common I've heard. They are esoteric deities, means that they are mostly associated with the esoteric sects of Buddhism in Japan, known as Shingon and Tendai. You can usually tell when something is an esoteric piece of art if it's got the wisdom kings in it. Of course, there are Buddhas, there are Bodhisattvas that are also used in esotericism, but only in esoteric art will you find the Myo-o as well. Now, the Myo-o, they serve a role as enforcers. They're, of course, a lot more nuanced than that. There are a lot of different purposes that they serve. There are a lot of different roles that they serve. There are a lot of different purposes that they serve. There are lots of different things that they act upon. But I think the one that I really want to focus on is as enforcers. They really make sure that everybody is sticking to the Buddhist path. They make sure that the practitioners of Buddhism are protected, and they ensure that nobody will stray from it at all. We're going to come to a piece a little bit later in this slideshow where we see Fudo Myo-o actually making sure that somebody stays on the Buddhist path. They are wrathful forms of Buddhas. So what we know about Buddhas is that they are serene deities, they are calm, they are blissful, and they are at peace. And they are actually, a lot of them exist beyond the concerns of the human world. But in order to act upon things, you're not going to have a Buddha who pulls out a club and starts punishing people that are wayward. or defending Buddhist practitioners. So the Buddhas will assume wrathful forms, or funu, to make sure that people stay on the path, but also are, I think, you know, there's a certain amount of fear in there. You're intimidated into staying on the Buddhist path as well. There is grace involved with that, but I'd say that there's a little bit of intimidation involved with that as well. The Myo-o are an amalgam of directional guardians, which we saw with the Shitano, and then gate guardians, which we saw with the Ni-o in the last lecture series. They are wrathful deities. They have a scary presence. They look like they're armed for battle and they're armed for war. So they are wrathful deities. They usually come in multi-armed and multi-faced forms. Because there is a basis in Hinduism, Hindu deities, with these deities, you would see the more arms and the more faces, the more powerful that they are. And then often the Myo-o, they are backed up against flame mandorlas. So there are things that are behind them that look like burning flames. So the first Myo-o that I actually want to discuss is Aizen Myo-o. He's a very popular deity in Japan. He derives from Ragaraja in India. He is a deity of passion. He is a deity that is often petitioned to make sure that romantic relationships are not going to affect the path to enlightenment. He is also very famous, which in later years, he became a protector of courtesans. You can tell that it's Aizen Myo-o when you look at him. He's got the multiple arms. He's got 6 arms, as we can see there. He's got 1 face, and he's got 3 eyes. Not all of the wisdom kings have 3 eyes, but Aizen Myo-o does. Often when there is pigmentation on his skin, if he's a sculpture, or if it's painted, you will see that he's got a red complexion. There is red on his skin. And also, a way to identify Aizen Myo-o is if you look at the crown, you will usually see a lion, a lion's head, or a lion, the full complete form of a lion, and it'll be up in the crown. And that is an identifying feature of Aizen Myo-o. If you see a lion in the crown, you can pretty definitively say that it is an Aizen Myo-o. Now, Aizen Myo-o, later on in Japanese Buddhist history, he became sort of the other half of Fudo Myo-o, who we will hear about in a few minutes. You will sometimes see Aizen and Fudo together on the same artwork or in the same temple building. It's really interesting. Just make sure that when you look at them, red skin, lion in crown, that is most likely going to be Aizen Myo-o. Now, Aizen Myo-o is not associated with a grouping called the Godai Myo-o. A lot of people might think that he is, but the Godai Myo-o is a completely different grouping. This one has a basis going all the way back to China, I would say, is the best connection that I can make. There's a lot of translations that happened of Indian scriptures in China that ended up creating this grouping of the Godai Myo-o. So you can see the different characters in there, the 5, the great, the wisdom, and the kings all together. There's also a grouping of 8, the Hachidai Myo-o, but those become a little bit more complicated. And because I'm only focusing on the Godai Myo-o today, I'm only going to be covering the 5 that you see on the painting to the right of the screen. So the Godai Myo-o are very prevalent in esoteric imagery. You can find them in mandala, you can find them in paintings, you can find them in sculptures. And if you go into a temple, you will find, usually if you go into a Shingon or Tendai, specifically I want to say Shingon, into those temple complexes, you might find something called the Godai-do, which is the Hall of the 5 Great Kings. And that means that that structure is dedicated to the Godai Myo-o. And you will find, most likely inside, the images of all 5 there. And the Godai Myo-o, they would most likely be petitioned in a ritual that is designed for the protection of the nation. There are many other nuanced purposes for them, but again, this is a very main purpose for them. Like we learned about the Shitenno last lecture, this time there are also directional associations for the Godai Myo-o. So you can see here Fudo Myo-o, who is probably the most famous or the most well-known of the wisdom kings in Japan. He's situated at the center, which kind of places him as the chief of the Godai Myo-o. To the north, you have Kongoyasha Myo-o. To the east, you have Gozanze Myo-o. To the south, you have Gundari Myo-o. And to the west, you have Daiitoku Myo-o. Now, don't worry, this isn't the only information that I'll be giving you. You will be able to see pictures in the following slides, and I will help you identify them as well. But know that their placement around the Godai-do or any other structure or in art, it might also be a way for you to indicate which deity it is. For example, if you see a group of 5 Myo-o and you see one in the center, that is most likely going to be Fudo Myo-o. If you see one to the north, then most likely Kongoyasha, and so on and so forth. Now, Fudo Myo-o, as I said, is probably one of the most famous of the wisdom kings, arguably the most famous. He is associated with many different rites and many different rituals. Kabuki actors, they have associations with him as well. He derives out of India as Achalanatha, and he is, as I said, considered the chief of the Godai Myo-o. He is often depicted either seated or standing. Here we see in the picture to the left that he is seated, and he is probably one of the only Myo-o that is actually depicted with 2 arms and 1 face. Now, there are exceptions that you will see on esoteric mandala, but for the most part, if you see a Myo-o with 2 arms, 1 face, it is most likely that that is going to be Fudo Myo-o. Another way to identify them is if we look at the tools in his hands. He's got a lasso in his left hand, that's called kenjaku, and then in his right hand, he's got a treasure sword, a hoken. And usually the treasure sword has also got a vajra handle or a kongo handle. That means that it's a representation of Indra's thunderbolt. As we can see to the back of him, there is a flame mandorla. But then some other identifying features of Fudo Myo-o as well is he's got this braid that comes down the left side of his face. The scriptures describe him as having a sort of fatty, paunchy body, sort of like a teenager is what some of the scriptures have described it as. Anen, who was a Tendai monk, described it he used the terms like a young child, the fat on the body. Fudo Myo-o, he often has a dedicated structure even for himself. So there's the Godai-do for the 5 Myo-o, but then there's also a Fudo-do, which is a building that is dedicated strictly to Fudo. Now, Fudo, he does have some acolytes that accompany him. There are 8 of them, but only 2 very commonly appear with him. And an easy way to identify that is looking at the color of their skin. Setaka is one of the doji, and he is identified as having red skin. He also carries a club. And so Setaka, we see her on the left side of the screen. He's got the red skin, he carries a club. And that is one way you can identify. He looks sort of ogreish. He looks sort of a little bit more, he looks like a feral child is, I think, a very funny way to describe him. Kongara, on the other hand, almost has a bodhisattva appearance to him. He's got white skin, he carries a lotus, he's got these flowing robes. And this piece, I just love this piece. It's called Fudo Myo-o Threatening Yuten. And the story about that is that Yuten is a monk who seems to be wandering away from the Buddhist path. And so a sculpture of Fudo steps down from the Daiza, the pedestal that he's on, and physically threatens Yuten with a sword to scare him to staying on the Buddhist path. Now, another interesting form of Fudo Myo-o is the Kurikara Fudo. It derives from the Nagaraja, the Dragon King Kulika, and it is often considered a manifestation of Fudo. Sometimes Fudo is depicted carrying a sword with a dragon coiling around it, and that is known as the Kurikara sword or the Kurikara Ken. And the story that this derives from is that Fudo faces off against a non-Buddhist foe, and after the non-Buddhist foe turns into a sword, then Fudo turns into a dragon, and he coils up around the sword, and he starts eating the sword from the tip down. And so we can see in this painting that we've got the head of the dragon going down over the tip of the sword there. It's very interesting. But if we go back, I also want to point out to you that we've got this stand-in for Fudo Myo-o in the form of the Kurikara, but to the right, we see standing here Seitaka, and to the left, we see Kongara. So right there, you can see with the red skin and the light skin, 2 ways to identify these doji, and then because we see them, because they are attending to the Kurikara, we can tell that that is a stand-in for Fudo Myo-o. The next of the Myo-o is Gozanze Myo-o. Trilokya Vijaya is the derivative from India. He is known as the subjugator of the 3 realms. He has multiple arms. Sometimes he has 6, and sometimes he has 8 arms. There are multiple faces. Right now, we can see 3 here. On some images, you might have a 4th one on the back, or sometimes it just might be the 3, the 2 on the sides, and the 1 facing the front, and then just hair in the back. So there are some variants on how you might see Gozanze Myo-o. But one way to identify Gozanze, especially because he's associated with a story where Dainichi is having trouble using calm words and using gentility to convert some of the Hindu deities. And so he assumes a wrathful form of Gozanze Myo-o, and he begins using violence to try and convert the Hindu deities. And this right here actually captures a moment where that violence is actually being manifest. So here we see Gozanze trampling on manifestations of Shiva, Mahasvara, and Uma, who is a consort to Mahasvara. The hand symbol that Gozanze forms is known as the Trilokya Vijaya mudra, or the Gozanze-in, and it's the mudra of subjugating the 3 realms. And as you can see, Gozanze, as a warlike deity, as a wisdom king, he carries in his hands implements of war and of meditation. Then there is Daiitoku Myo-o. He is known as Yamantaka. He is also known as the destroyer of death. And what's really interesting about the destroyer of death story, it has a basis in a Tibetan legend. And once we get to kind of talking about the water buffalo, then we realize the connections it has to Vajrayana and the practice of Vajrayana in Tibet. Because there is a story where there is a monk who is obsessed with achieving enlightenment. He goes into a cave and he begins to meditate on the floor of this cave. And he is so close to achieving meditation. He is nearly there. And then all of a sudden, a couple thieves barge into the cave, carrying with them a stolen water buffalo, or sometimes a bull in different stories. And the monk, he pleads with these thieves, saying, please don't butcher them. Please don't disturb me. I am almost at the point of enlightenment. I beseech thee, please, would you leave me alone? But the thieves, they become so infuriated by the gall of this monk that they slaughter the water buffalo right in front of him. They chop off the head of the water buffalo, and then just to make matters worse, they go to the monk and they murder him and cut off his head as well. And that's not the ending though. What ends up happening is the monk grabs the head, miraculously grabs the head of the bull, places it onto his own neck stump, and then there becomes this fusion where the monk rises with the head of a bull. And he starts raging against the thieves and kills them. And then in this angered state, because he was not able to achieve enlightenment, he starts rampaging across the Tibetan countryside until finally the people in Tibet, they end up petitioning Manjushri, saying, please, we ask that you would save us. And Manjushri comes and he assumes the form of this exact same form of Yama, of the god of death. He also has a water buffalo head. He has a wrathful body. And there's this epic battle between Yama and Yamantaka. And Yamantaka, who is the manifestation of Manjushri, ends up destroying death. And that's why we start to see this involvement and this association of the water buffalo with Daiitoku Myo-o and with the destroyer of death. If you look at the hand, you will see that they form a konpon-in, or the mudra of restraint. Manjushri ended up restraining death and has control over it. And I find that to be a very comforting sort of detail in practice. So if you see Daiitoku Myo-o, if you see a wrathful deity sitting on the back of a water buffalo or a bull, it is most likely going to be Daiitoku Myo-o. Another one is Gundari Myo-o. Gundari Myo-o derives from Kundali. You might recognize Kundali as a term that is you see a lot in a lot of yoga, like the Kundalini, the energy that lies latent at the base of the spine. And the idea of a Kundalini is that it's snake-like, it's serpentine. And so you see on Gundari, you see a lot of these snake motifs. And if we look closely at what's around Gundari Myo-o's neck, you will see a couple snakes intertwined around his neck. If you look closely at his wrists, he's got a wristband, an armlet that looks like a snake. And if you see snake imagery on a deity, looking very closely at the wrist, looking very closely at the ankles, looking closely at the clothing, and looking closely at the neck, if you see snakes, it is most likely going to be Gundari. If you look under the feet, you will not see any deities under there. He is standing on two lotus pedestals. His feet are sort of suggestions of movement. But because we don't see any deities there, we can say for a fact that it's not Trilokya Vijaya, it's not Gozanze Myo-o, it is in fact Gundari Myo-o. The final of the Godai Myo-o that I'll be discussing is Kongoyasha Myo-o. And he derives from a Bodhisattva in Tibet, in India, in the Himalayan region of Buddhism. He's associated with Vajrayaksa, who began as a Bodhisattva, but slowly got transformed into a wisdom king in Eastern Asia. He carries in his hands Vajra implements. You'll see again that he's not trampling on deities. He's not forming a mudra with his hands. He is not sitting on an animal. Rather, he is the only one who in the forearms, in the two hands in the front of his chest, you can see that the way they are staggered and they are holding Vajra implements or Kongo implements. You can tell that it is a Kongo implement by these different points that veer onto it. And so to identify Kongoyasha, you really need to look at the tools that he is holding in his forefront hands, not the ones at the sides, because those can actually be identified with other Myo-o as well. Like you see a lasso up in the top right hand there. It's not Fudo Myo-o, it is Kongoyasha. I hope that makes sense for everybody, that you might see different implements appear here, there, and everywhere, but really you need to be looking at these forefront hands to be able to identify a Myo-o. Now, what I'm going to be doing, that is a very quick, very dirty way to identify these Myo-o. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance to being able to describe them and identify them, but I feel like I hit all of the major points to be able to identify these deities at first glance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quiz you via the poll function. I just want to note, last time we had a few issues. You might have to move the poll on your screen so that you can see the images. All right, so I'm going to set the poll going now. So for the first one, which wisdom king is this? Is it Gozanze? Is it Gundari? Or is it Daiitoku? For number 2, is it Fudo? Is it Kongoyasha? Or is it Gozanze? And for number 3, is this Fudo? Is it Daiitoku? Or is it Aizen? I want you to look at the details in each of them. For example, for number 1, look at the wrists. Look at the neck. For number 2, look at the number of arms and look at the tools that he carries. For number 3, I want you to look at the crown and I want you to look at the color of the skin. Being able to identify those, looking at each of those features, that is going to help you identify these deities at a first glance. So I'll probably give another 30 seconds on the voting before we end the poll, and then I will reveal the answers. So again, looking at number 1, look at the wrists, look at the ankles, look at what's around the neck. For number 2, look at the tools in the hand and look at the number of arms and then look at the head as well. Do you see that little lock coming down beside the face? For number 3, look at the color, the complexion of the skin. Look at the crown. Look what is sitting in that flame-like hair. All right, I'm going to give 15 seconds more, a little bit of bonus time. Okay, let's see the results. So I'm hoping that you can all see the results there. I'm going to put the answers up on the screen right now. You can see that Gundari, you can see number 1 is Gundari, and very good for everybody who answered that. You look at the wrists, you look at the ankles, you look at the neck, and yes, you can see all of these snake imagery. And so that is Gundari Myo-o. For number 2, you are looking at the tools in the hand, the lasso in the left hand, the hoken, the sword in the right hand. And you can see that braid coming along the left side of the face. So of course that means that it's Fudo Myo-o. And then for number 3, we can see the complexion of the skin, the red skin, and then we can see also the lion insignia in the crown. And that helps us to identify him as Aizen Myo-o. So very good job for everybody that answered. I'm excited that you all learned this so quickly, it seems. Now, sites where you can see some of these deities. The Godai Myo-o as a collective, you can see at Koyasan, you can see at Toji, you can see at Daikakuji, you can see at Daigoji, you can see it at Tsurugako, I always have trouble pronouncing this one, Tsurugaoka Hachimangu. For the Fudo Myo-o alone, you can see depictions of him at Manshuin and Onjoji. There are, of course, many other temples that are associated with individual images of him, but I would say that those are some of the more interesting places you can see. Fudo Myo-o with Doji, with his acolytes, you can see at the Ganjo Juin. Kurikara Fudo, you can see at Koyasan, Ryu Koin. And then Gozanze Myo-o is also often depicted, or not often, but sometimes depicted alone individually. And you can see an individual or an independent depiction of him at Kongoji. Aizen Myo-o, you can see him at the Saidaiji, and it's a carving by Zen-en. Now, I just want to bring your attention to an exhibition that we did in the past. I worked closely with Ayako Yoshida and Takuma Kamine, who is a Tokyo-based artist. And what he does is he creates these fusions of robotic entities and Buddhist deities. And he decided that one series he was going to put together was all about the Myo-o. And so him and I collaborated on putting together an exhibition along with Ayako Yoshida to make the Myo-o in the Shell exhibition. And if you want further details about that, you can go to the website at the bottom of the page, or you can email me. So I'm going to open up to questions here. And so I am going to open up the question and answer, and I'm going to pick a couple of the questions. So Richard Saisho, he asks, are the directions for the Myo-o similar to the Tenbu, where north is not at the top? That's a really good question. In a lot of mandala, north is actually to the right of the image, rather than to the top. And that way, you have to bear that in mind when you look at mandala to make sure that you are identifying the proper deity. So a lot of mandala, they will depict the deity, or they'll depict north to the right of the image, rather than to the top of it. Cindy Rine, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your last name. Cindy Rin asks, can you talk about the flame symbol? So the flame at the back of the Myo-o that makes up the mandala, I've heard many different ideas as to what it could be, but the most common that I've read, in Richard K. Payne, for example, the literature that he's written, he associates the flame mandala with the fires of Garuda, or the purifying flames in Hinduism. That the fire, it burns things away. And you would see this imagery also continued on in the Goma ritual, which is a Shingon ritual that is largely associated with Fudo Myo-o. And this fire, it burns away and it obliterates obstacles to enlightenment. And I'm going to do one more question. Brandon Wallace asks, do the Wisdom Kings have a basis in Buddhist sutras? And are they revered in Theravada Buddhism or only Mahayana? They are actually associated largely with the esoteric traditions, Vajrayana specifically. Although there are deities, there is some carryover into Mahayana as well. Mahayana, as you know, is the larger, it's the one that really moved across East Asia. And probably, some people say it's a subdivision of Mahayana, and some people say Vajrayana is its own development. But in either case, Vajrayana incorporates a lot of the Wisdom Kings. And the Wisdom Kings, they appear in several of the different sutras. The most common being the Benevolent Kings Sutra, which was translated in the 4th century by Kumarajaiva, and then it was also translated in the 8th century by Amagavajra. And in Amagavajra's translation of the Benevolent Kings Sutra, that's when you start to see the Myo-o take on the forms that they do. The Wisdom Kings take on the forms that they do. That's all the time that I have right now. Thank you very much for all the fantastic questions. If you would like to forward these questions to me, send me an email at michaelvanhardingsveld@gmail.com. I will be happy to answer as much as possible, or even direct you to other resources where you might be able to read about it. As you can see that a poll appeared on the screen, please take a moment to complete the digital lecture questionnaire via the poll function. If you would like to comment on today's programming, I want to remind you that you can do so through the question and answer function. Thank you for joining us today. Our next virtual lecture, which will cover Bodhisattvas, will take place on August 13th, 2020 at 7 p.m. PST. I hope to see you all there, and thank you again for joining.
Hi, thank you, Michael. It was really great lecture. We saw the 150 people joined, and we have many questions from you guys. Thank you for attention. And as we answered some of the questions, we will upload the video and the slides of this lecture probably tomorrow. So if you have